Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper, beneath the marble, below the chants, sealed where light has never trespassed. You walk down a dim corridor that smells faintly of incense and limestone dust, where every echo feels like it carries a confession that never found forgiveness. A single oil lamp flickers, and in that trembling light, you catch the outline of a locked door marked with a sigil you've never seen in any cathedral. Somewhere behind it, the air seems to hum, as if prayer itself were trapped. You can almost hear a whisper, or maybe that's just your imagination reminding you that you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, because somehow it feels right to share our coordinates before descending into forbidden history together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as the Vatican's night watch bells toll in the distance. You follow that sound through a courtyard where marble angels stare downward, their eyes weathered smooth by centuries of disbelief. The closer you get to the archives, the heavier the air becomes, as though the very stones remember the words the church swore to forget. You reach the threshold, fingers brushing over ancient metal, and beneath your touch, the door almost sighs, because every secret here has been waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. In the stillness of the Vatican's forbidden archives, your candle trembles against the draft that shouldn't be there, and you see it. Wedged behind a cracked ledger of baptisms, a slim volume bound in dark leather that feels too warm for something so old. Its spine carries no title, only a faint red cross scorched into the cover, crooked and clumsy as if someone carved it in haste. The parchment inside is brittle and smells faintly of myrrh and old iron, and the ink, though faded, still glimmers when caught by candlelight. The handwriting is uneven, more like the frantic notes of a witness than the calm script of a monk. Between prayers and blessings there are sketches of bound figures surrounded by circles, their faces half-human, half-tormented blur, each labeled Purificatio Incompleta, incomplete purification. You turn the page, and tucked between Latin psalms is a marginal note in vernacular Italian. Non era posseduta, ma ascoltata. She wasn't possessed, she was heard. The historian in you tries to stay calm. After all, one mainstream fact is that the Church has officially approved exorcism rites since 1614, carefully catalogued and controlled. Yet this book predates that written centuries earlier, as if the idea of casting out demons began as something far less organized and far more desperate. One of the more eccentric pages includes a formula involving powdered lilies and sanctified iron dust. A detail so strange it edges into the realm of the absurd, or maybe early chemistry in disguise. Scholars have long debated whether such texts were the work of mystics, early psychologists, or bored monks with too much wine and too little supervision. You hold the book carefully, aware that every time the candle flame dances across its pages, the shadows on the wall seem to move in patterns of their own, like the faint echo of something that still wants to be read. The corridor narrows as you descend, the air thickening with a damp, metallic scent that clings to your throat like regret. At the bottom of the staircase, a door waits. No handle, no inscription, only a small brass plate engraved with 3 words: Contagion of Souls. It's the sort of label bureaucrats invent when they don't want anyone asking questions. You press your ear against the metal and hear nothing, not even the shifting of air, but the cold radiates outward as if the room itself resents being disturbed. When the hinges finally yield, the light from your candle seems to die mid-air, smothered by a darkness that feels almost alive. Inside, rows of iron shelves sag beneath decaying folders, but every ledger, every registry, every supposed record of exorcism is torn precisely where names should be. One mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind. The Vatican has maintained the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith since 1542, tasked with guarding the purity of belief and sometimes, conveniently, with making troublesome evidence disappear. Somewhere between the official accounts of saints and miracles, these pages should have existed, but they don't. What remains instead are cryptic notes like "case unresolved," "removed to lower vault," and "afflicted relocated under silence." You brush dust from a corner shelf and find a small tag stamped with a date, 1743, and a single word, levitatio. You'd laugh if your skin weren't prickling, remembering that fringe rumor from a Jesuit diary about a novice who floated 3 feet above the ground mid-prayer, witnessed by 5 monks and denied by 6. Historians still argue whether the entry was metaphor or panic-induced poetry, but as you stand there, your candle flame bends sideways. No draft, no movement, just a subtle defiance of gravity that leaves you half tempted to blow it out and run. Instead, you take a breath, steady your shaking hand, and step deeper into the dark, where the silence begins to sound almost like breathing. You awaken beneath the echo of bells you do not remember hearing, their tones distant yet sharp enough to slice through centuries. The archives behind you fade into the smell of candle smoke and wet stone, and ahead lies a long, narrow hall lined with frescoes of saints that seem to be watching you, not in reverence, but in warning. You walk forward, your fingertips brushing the chipped paint of angels who have long since lost their halos, and somewhere between one step and the next, time folds in on itself. The torches burn brighter, the air thickens with incense, and suddenly you're standing in a cold Roman chamber of 1479, the winter that history forgot to write about. Before you stands the first woman ever accused not of witchcraft or heresy, but of something far stranger, hosting a presence the Church refused to name. Her name, according to a single surviving fragment, was Contessa Isabetta de Sangro, a Neapolitan noblewoman whose beauty was said to unnerve priests. Her family claimed she began to speak languages she had never learned, Greek, Aramaic, and one that even scholars at the University of Bologna couldn't identify. Some whispered that it wasn't possession at all, but communion with something ancient, something that whispered back when prayed to. The Vatican called for an inquiry, though it was not officially an exorcism, because that term, in the 15th century, was reserved for the extraordinary, and this was far worse. You stand beside the tribunal as the Contessa is led into the candlelight, wrists bound not in chains but in red silk ribbon, a detail some scholars believe symbolized her noble status, while others think it was a quiet attempt to bind the spirit without drawing scandal. Her eyes are calm, too calm, and when she looks toward the clerics, a hush falls that even the torches respect. One mainstream historical fact echoes through your mind. Pope Sixtus IV did indeed authorize a commission in 1479 to investigate unnatural spiritual manifestations in southern Italy, a euphemism that conveniently covered everything from stigmata to spontaneous combustion. This trial could easily have been one of those, buried under layers of theological euphemism. The chief inquisitor, Cardinal Manfredi, begins to read the charges, his voice brittle with fear disguised as authority. You are accused of harboring a presence not of divine order, of conversing with the unclean, and of trespassing upon the limits of sanctified will. The Contessa smiles faintly and says nothing. You can feel the room tighten. The first night of the trial is spent in prayers and Latin recitations that echo like broken machinery. The clerics circle her, sprinkling holy water that steams on her skin, not from heat, but as if the air itself rejects sanctity. The witnesses tremble, not because of what they see, but because they can't decide whether it's happening at all. A record in the tribunal's minutes, one that survived by accident, mentions that the candle flames inverted during prayer, burning downward, a detail dismissed later as ink damage. Yet it's written twice, by different hands. One fringe tidbit that surfaced centuries later came from a Jesuit historian who claimed that the Contessa's reflection did not move with her during questioning. Instead, it appeared a second too late. as though reality lagged in her presence. You don't know whether to laugh or shiver, so you do both silently, like a viewer who knows a jump scare is coming but can't turn away. 3 days pass. The Contessa neither eats nor sleeps, yet she grows no weaker. The witnesses, mostly clerics and scribes, begin reporting dreams of a shadowy figure sitting at the edge of their beds, whispering in the same unrecognizable tongue she'd spoken. When they wake, they can't recall the words, but find their ears ringing with faint choral tones, almost like reversed hymns. The inquisitors consult their manuals, flipping through thick tomes that warn of false signs, demonic trickery, and mass delusion, yet no one mentions the simplest explanation: collective guilt. After all, this was an age when faith was not proof, but weapon, and sometimes the sharpest blade was belief itself. On the 4th night, something changes. A young priest named Matteo, barely 20 and too brave for his own good, asks permission to read aloud from the Book of Tobias, the passage where the archangel Raphael drives away the demon Asmodeus with the smoke of burning fish liver. The irony isn't lost on you. Even in a trial of faith, no one can resist a little dramatic flair. As Matteo reads, the Contessa begins to hum, not a hymn, not a cry, just a soft, rhythmic hum that vibrates the floor. The torches flicker, and the heavy stone crucifix behind her rattles against its bracket. The inquisitors freeze, unsure whether to stop or continue, and in that hesitation lies the entire tragedy of medieval faith. Too afraid to believe, too terrified to doubt. Then she speaks, her voice low, steady, and impossibly clear. You cannot cast out what was invited. The words hang there, echoing in both air and mind, and Matteo drops his book. That single sentence becomes the centerpiece of every later debate about this trial. Some modern historians, those brave enough to dig through the Vatican's restricted archives, argue that it was proof of psychological hysteria, perhaps the result of isolation, grief, or fasting. Others insist it was evidence of early hypnotic trances mistaken for possession. But a small group of fringe theologians suggest a far more unsettling theory: that Isabella was part of a forgotten sect within Christianity that believed holiness could only be proven by surviving contact with evil, a spiritual test taken literally. This trial of the soul, they argue, was once a hidden rite of purification later outlawed by Rome for obvious reasons. It worked too well and left no room for priests. You lean against the cold stone wall, trying to imagine what it must have been like. The candles sputtering, the air thick with burnt herbs, the endless Latin recitations echoing through sleepless nights. The Contessa, still bound in silk, sits motionless while men in vestments argue theology over her head like vultures dividing a carcass. You can almost smell the ink of their quills, sharp and metallic, scratching judgment into parchment that no one will read. She tilts her head toward you, or maybe toward the unseen scribe across the room, and whispers something too faint to catch. A few words survive in the margin of a clerk's notebook. He heard his own name. That same clerk later renounced his post and joined a monastery in the Alps, claiming he'd been followed by voices that weren't his conscience. The church called it fatigue. Scholars today call it an early case of shared auditory hallucination. You call it a bad night's sleep. But the humor doesn't stick. The deeper you peer into this story, the more it feels like staring at a mirror that reflects not the past, but your own unease. Faith, fear, and authority all blur together until it's impossible to tell who's exorcising whom. Was the Contessa possessed? Or was the church itself trembling under the weight of its own invention? The idea that evil could be contained, catalogued, and banished like a bureaucratic form? One Jesuit commentator from the 18th century, rediscovering fragments of this case, called it a lesson in institutional haunting. He meant that once you create a ritual to fight darkness, you also create a darkness worth fighting. The trial's end is abrupt, almost disappointingly bureaucratic. The records simply stop. One day she's there, the next she isn't. No verdict, no execution, no absolution. just an empty line where her name should be, followed by a new heading. Doctrine Review Committee Findings, 1480. The surviving pages discuss potential contamination of spiritual procedure and ritual protocols to prevent reoccurrence, which, translated from ecclesiastical Latin, means, "We will pretend this never happened." The Contessa vanishes from history. Her family estates were confiscated for maintenance of church purity, and her lineage disappears within 2 generations. A strange coincidence, unless you believe in generational curses, though personally you'd blame medieval inheritance law first. Still, one fragment from the trial's aftermath refuses to fade. In 1492, an anonymous painter, some attribute him to the school of Botticelli, completed a small fresco in a rural chapel outside Florence. It shows a woman in red silk kneeling before a black-winged angel. The inscription beneath reads, "She spoke and was not burned." Art historians dismiss it as allegory, but when infrared scans were done in the 1990s, they revealed something odd beneath the paint. An earlier version of the same scene, except in that layer, the angel isn't offering a blessing, it's whispering into her ear. A coincidence, or the echo of a story no one was supposed to paint. You exhale, the air in this imagined tribunal suddenly colder than before. You think of all the people over centuries who must have walked past these records, knowing, suspecting, but choosing silence over curiosity. Perhaps that's the real exorcism, not of spirits, but of memory itself. To forget what frightens us is the Church's most efficient ritual, and perhaps the only one that always works. The candles in the chamber flicker low, their wax puddling like tears across stone. The inquisitors disperse, muttering prayers that sound more like apologies, and as the Contessa's silk bindings fall away, so too does her presence. There is no scream, no collapse, no triumphant cry of victory, only a sigh, long and thin, like the closing of a century. And when you blink, the trial is gone. The frescoed saints above you have regained their halos, their eyes blank once more. The Vatican's corridors hum quietly, the modern electric bulbs humming where torches once burned. You stand in front of a locked cabinet labeled Case File 0A, Restricted, Desangro Inquiry, its edges sealed with red wax that looks suspiciously fresh. You almost reach out to touch it, but the air shifts, carrying with it the faintest whisper of silk against stone, a sound that doesn't belong in this century. You smile to yourself, because by now you've realized something crucial. The Church never destroyed its secrets. It only learned to keep them on a tighter leash. And as you turn to leave, a faint reflection in the glass follows a heartbeat too late, just as hers did. And you realize this story isn't over. It's simply waiting for the next fool to open the door. You step out of the archives, and the cool air of Rome feels different now, heavier with the weight of all the things you shouldn't have learned. Somewhere above, the bells of St. Peter's ring out like reminders of obedience, but you're already walking against the rhythm, back into history's untidy corners. When people talk about exorcisms, they imagine cloisters and Latin chants, not tropical humidity and mosquito bites. Yet that's where the Church's strangest confrontations with evil took place. Not in cathedrals, but under the tin roofs of colonial missions where the world itself felt unfinished. You close your eyes, and time folds again. Now you're in the 17th century, somewhere in the jungles of South America, where friars wore cassocks soaked with sweat and faith equally damp with doubt. A carved crucifix leans against a mud brick wall, and behind it, a missionary whispers prayers over a trembling boy said to be touched by the devil. The irony, of course, is that his devil speaks a language the friar refuses to learn. One mainstream historical fact to anchor this scene: the Catholic Church sent thousands of missionaries to the Americas between 1500 and 1800, many trained in exorcism rites adapted from the Rituale Romanum. Yet those same rites, written for stone chapels, found themselves wielded under the buzz of jungle flies and the eyes of spirits older than Christianity. The missionary, Father Alonso de la Cruz, keeps a diary, one that would later vanish into the Vatican's linguistic archive, and in it, He describes what he calls voices of the forest. He writes that when he recited the prayers of St. Michael, the wind stopped and the leaves turned inward as though listening. At night, he heard chants in languages he couldn't trace, not quite human, but rhythmic enough to feel like intention. And then came the detail that makes modern readers pause. He claimed one of the indigenous elders could end those sounds by burning resin and humming in time with his heartbeat. The friars, of course, called this sorcery. You might call it sound therapy, or irony. It's difficult to say which. The following year, the mission recorded 12 possessions, 11 liberations, and one case so confusing they filed it under miraculum dubium, a doubtful miracle. That term appears throughout the archives whenever the church didn't know whether to blame God or geology. The friars performed their exorcisms by adapting the language of conquest to the vocabulary of faith. The devil became the convenient explanation for everything unfamiliar. Disease, drought, rebellion, even joy expressed too loudly. It's easy to forget that to a man from Seville or Lisbon, laughter under a blood-red sunset could look suspiciously like a spell. But something curious happens when fear travels. It absorbs the shape of the land. The exorcists who came to these new worlds began to describe demons that didn't sound European anymore. Gone were the forked tongues and sulfur. Now they had feathers, mirrors for eyes, or appeared in dreams as ancestors. Scholars debate whether these accounts reveal syncretism or mere confusion, but either way, the result was the same. Spiritual cross-pollination, half theology, half anthropology. One fringe tidbit from the 1720 Jesuit letters mentions an exorcism in Peru where the priest used a mirror to trap a spirit. When the ritual ended, he buried the mirror, fearing it might reflect the wrong soul next time. Centuries later, archaeologists actually found a small silver mirror beneath the ruins of a Jesuit church near Cusco, etched with both Latin and Quechua inscriptions. Coincidence? Probably. But it's a coincidence that hums. By the 18th century, Rome began to worry that its missionaries were collecting demons faster than souls. Reports arrived describing hybrid rituals, Latin psalms whispered alongside tribal drums, holy water mixed with crushed herbs, rosaries hung beside carved idols. The church called it contamination. Historians today might call it adaptation. Still, back in the libraries of Europe, theologians debated whether these possessions were spiritual or psychological. A few bold scholars even proposed that colonial exorcisms were experiments in cross-cultural healing long before the word psychology existed. They were, in a sense, studying trauma, just with incense instead of journals. One letter from the Franciscan order in Mexico in 1695 complains that the afflicted speak of burning pain in the mind, and yet no fever shows. It's almost funny. The priests stumbled onto anxiety centuries before Freud, and their solution was still, predictably, more Latin. There's one case that stands out from this era, the so-called trial of San Miguel del Monte. In 1634, a native woman named Amaru was accused of being possessed after she predicted the death of a Spanish officer who had desecrated her village shrine. When he died 2 days later, felled by an infected cut, the friars declared her host to the serpent of deception. The trial transcript still exists, tucked in a dusty file marked Inquisitio Minor 67b. It records that during her interrogation, Amaru spoke calmly, even humorously, telling her accusers, "If the devil borrowed my voice, at least he used it to tell the truth." Not exactly the line you'd expect in a sermon. The exorcism that followed lasted 3 nights, during which she was neither burned nor freed. Instead, she was sent to a convent, where she became a healer of remarkable success. Patients called her the one who sings the fevers away. The irony writes itself. The church eventually declared her ambiguous, a category more common than saints or sinners combined. What lingers most from these colonial exorcisms is the sensory confusion of it all. Imagine it. Jungles thick with noise, insects droning like invisible choirs, fires spitting resin smoke into humid air, and somewhere in that chaos, a trembling voice reciting prayers from a continent away. You can almost feel the friar's hands shaking as he sprinkles holy water that immediately evaporates, his robe clinging to his skin, his faith clinging harder. You'd think it absurd until you remember that history has always been written by tired men trying to describe things they didn't understand. The line between miracle and misunderstanding was thinner than a mosquito's wing. The modern church tends to frame this period as evangelization, but there's a quiet undercurrent of unease in its surviving letters. Some confess that the more they performed exorcisms, the less they felt sure which side they were on. One Dominican friar in Guatemala wrote, "The forest watches. It knows the words we do not." That sentence earned him a recall to Spain for fatigued reasoning. Yet, his phrase survives, copied by later missionaries who likely understood too well. Colonial exorcisms weren't just about demons, they were about territory. To claim land was one thing, to claim souls was another. Every prayer spoken over a convert was also a declaration of ownership. You can almost hear the bureaucracy behind it. Please describe nature of possession. Attach 2 witnesses. Mark location of miracle for further investigation. Faith, it turns out, has always loved paperwork. There's a modern scholarly debate that treats these exorcisms as a form of proto-ethnography. The friars documented what they thought were spiritual symptoms, but many of their observations align eerily with indigenous cosmologies. For example, in Amazonian traditions, illness is often described as a spirit leaving the body to wander, a poetic way of describing dissociation. The missionaries, seeing this, assumed possession. They responded not with empathy, but ritual, which paradoxically sometimes worked because ritual, no matter its origin, gives structure to fear. You could argue that an exorcism is really just organized anxiety therapy with incense and better costumes. Don't quote me on that during confession. Still, the Church did try to regulate these global encounters. In 1702, the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith issued new guidelines. Let no exorcism be performed without papal text and native witness, lest the devil be disguised by the tongue of men. It sounds noble, but the subtext is clear. They didn't trust their own clergy anymore. Rumors had spread that certain priests had begun learning local incantations, fusing them with psalms, and finding them oddly effective. The Vatican responded as it always does to success it didn't invent, by calling it heresy. You have to admire the consistency. One of the more fascinating oddities of this period involves what's now known as the fever ritual. Records show that in 1683, Jesuits in the Caribbean tried to adapt the exorcism prayer Vade retro Satana, begone Satan, to combat malaria. They believed the sickness was demonic in nature and began performing rites over infected water sources. Strangely, in a few cases, the fevers subsided, not because the prayers worked, of course, but because the friars unwittingly chose cleaner wells. Still, word spread that Latin could cure disease, and locals began mimicking the ritual without priests, chanting over water and invoking saints whose names they'd only half heard. The Church labeled it superstition. Anthropologists later called it grassroots medicine. Either way, people survived, and survival is its own theology. As centuries passed, these colonial exorcisms blurred into folklore. The possessed became storytellers, the priests became cautionary figures, and every village had a tale about a night when prayers battled unseen things in the dark. The modern world likes to call them legends, but if you listen carefully, you'll notice something consistent in all of them. A strange sympathy between the healer and the afflicted, as if both sides were secretly on the same team. In a way, they were. The demon was just the name they gave to grief, guilt, and the unbearable loneliness of being human in a land where even God seemed foreign. But the story doesn't end with faith's triumph. It ends, as always, with paperwork. When the colonial archives were reviewed in the 19th century, the Vatican quietly sealed thousands of pages under the heading Spiritus Varius, various spirits. That phrase covers everything from confirmed possessions to misfiled weather reports, which feels about right. A century later, scholars rediscovered some of these reports and noticed something uncanny. Many described symptoms identical to modern trauma responses: night terrors, disassociation, spontaneous weeping. The demons, it seemed, had names after all, just not the ones the church preferred. You walk out of this memory, back into the Roman dusk, the marble under your shoes cooling with evening. The city hums softly, unaware that beneath its churches lie the echoes of 1,000 half-understood prayers. Somewhere in those sealed cabinets, the colonial friars' diaries rest in darkness, pages swollen with humidity and guilt. You can almost imagine them whispering to one another, comparing notes on what it means to cast out pain and accidentally invent psychology along the way. You glance up at the dome of St. Peter's, that great glittering promise of certainty, and think about how belief travels, like a seed, like a virus, like a rumor that can never quite be killed. Maybe that's the secret at the heart of all these forbidden exorcisms. They were never about purging evil, but about naming it, shaping it into something survivable. And in that way, every whispered prayer in every forgotten jungle becomes part of a single human pattern: the need to explain what hurts us before it devours us. As you turn to leave, a gust of warm wind stirs the dust at your feet, carrying the faint scent of resin and iron, and you hear it. The soft hum of a language you don't know but somehow understand. It sounds suspiciously like forgiveness pretending to be fear. You leave the humid breath of the tropics behind and step straight into a world that exhales frost instead of incense, a place where the air itself feels like it's holding its breath. The year is 1711, and you find yourself trudging through snow along the jagged hills of Bavaria. The moonlight spills like spilled milk over a monastery that looks half swallowed by ice, its bell tower leaning under the weight of snow, its windows shuttered tight, as though the very building is trying to keep something inside. Your boots crunch against the crust of frozen ground, and every sound seems amplified, hanging in the air longer than it should. The abbey, known in church records as Sanctum Silens, the Silent Holy, was said to house monks who practiced an extreme vow of quietude. Yet the silence that lives here now feels less like devotion and more like dread. A single, verifiable historical fact anchors this story. The region of Upper Bavaria did experience one of the harshest winters of the 18th century, a season recorded in parish notes as the year the rivers froze to confession. In that same record, there's a marginal note: Monastery of Silence, 40 days of disturbance, voices in the walls. Inside, the stone corridors smell of cold wax and mildew. The monks, wrapped in heavy wool, move like ghosts through a gray world of prayer and fatigue. One of them, Brother Anselm, keeps a meticulous journal, the kind of account that historians later call a curiosity, and archivists label restricted access. He writes of nights when the choir room trembled even though no wind stirred outside, when the air seemed to hum as if the earth itself were reciting psalms backward. His Latin is precise, his fear not. On the 7th night, he notes that the crucifix above the altar tilted forward without cause, spilling candle wax onto the floor in the shape of an open hand. On the 10th, he hears a knock beneath the chapel stones, rhythmic, deliberate. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. And on the 12th, one of the brothers, a novice named Johann, begins to answer the knocks, murmuring under his breath in a tone no one recognizes. It starts like that. Simple, absurd. The kind of thing you'd dismiss if you weren't stuck in an abbey where frost paints halos on your breath and faith is the only heat left. The monks try prayer first, of course. When that fails, they resort to fasting, thinking hunger will cleanse whatever stirs below. But the knocking doesn't stop. It only changes tempo, aligning eerily with the rhythm of their chants. On the 15th night, they break their vow of silence. It's Brother Matthias who finally speaks, his voice brittle from disuse. If it is the devil, then he prays with us. And that's the moment you realize that exorcism isn't always about people. It's about places that remember too much. A contemporary scholar might call this the earliest recorded case of environmental haunting, though the monks wouldn't have used such polite vocabulary. They called it infestatio, a spiritual infection. One mainstream fact: the Catholic Church does officially distinguish between possession of persons and infestation of objects or locations. The monks, improvising without guidance, decided to treat their monastery as if it were a patient. They sprinkled holy water along the walls, placed relics in doorways, and recited blessings over the snow itself. For 3 days, it seemed to help, until the temperature plunged even lower. Frost bloomed along the interior stonework like veins, and the chapel organ began to play faint notes on its own, pipes whistling as if exhaling trapped breath. That detail, an organ playing without touch, was later recorded in the Diocesan Archive of Augsburg, marked "Unverified Phenomenon, Natural Explanation Pending." The explanation never arrived. Then came the 40 Nights of Endurance, what Anselm calls the dialogue of cold and prayer. During this time, the monks took turns keeping vigil in the chapel, watching the shadows crawl across the altar like slow water. They heard voices, sometimes single, sometimes in chorus, but what unnerved them most was that the voices never contradicted Scripture. They quoted it perfectly. That's when even the bravest among them began to suspect the unthinkable, that whatever haunted them knew God better than they did. Brother Johann, the novice who once whispered to the knocking beneath the floor, fell ill around the 22nd night. His skin turned pale blue, his pulse slowed, and yet he kept smiling, as though hearing something comforting beyond the veil of frost. He died seated upright in the pew, hands clasped, a serene half-grin on his lips. The next morning, Anselm found on the altar a patch of melted ice in the shape of a cross. He wrote simply, "The warmth returned to him, but not to us." Later researchers found trace mentions of this event in a 19th century Jesuit study of psychogenic epidemics in monastic environments. That's academic code for mass hallucination caused by stress and starvation. The theory goes that extreme cold and isolation triggered synchronized delusions, a shared belief that the abbey itself was alive. Maybe it was. The human mind, after all, doesn't need demons when hypothermia will do. Yet some details resist explanation. For instance, Anselm describes one night when the ice on the chapel floor fractured into symmetrical lines, forming a perfect circle around the altar. No cracks elsewhere. He measured it, exactly 9 feet across. "It looked like breath trapped in stone," he wrote. Scientists later tried to reproduce it in controlled conditions and failed. Of course, it could just be coincidence. But if you've ever seen geometry appear where chaos should be, you'll know why coincidence rarely comforts. The abbey's abbot, desperate to restore order, summoned a visiting priest rumored to have studied under exorcists in Rome, Father Eberhard. The man arrived wrapped in furs, carrying a brass censer and a look of weary skepticism. His first words on entering were, "There is no devil here, only cold." He lasted 2 nights before demanding his departure. According to Anselm's notes, he was found sitting in his quarters, shivering violently despite the fire burning bright, muttering, "The Psalms have teeth." He left the next morning without saying Mass. That phrase, "the Psalms have teeth," would become the subject of theological essays centuries later, debated as metaphor or madness. But one fringe tidbit suggests it wasn't metaphor at all. A sealed Vatican memo from 1720 mentions confiscated relic fragments from Sanctum Silens, including one wooden rosary bearing impressions of dentition, human or otherwise. How exactly a rosary gets bitten is left to imagination. By the 35th night, the monks could no longer tell waking from dreaming. They reported seeing figures made of mist moving along the cloisters, sometimes familiar, sometimes resembling long-dead brothers. The abbey bells rang at midnight with no one at the ropes. The snow outside shaped itself into faint ridges like fingerprints pressing upward from below. Anselm's handwriting grows erratic here, ink smeared as if written by trembling hands. He begins referring to the entity not as a demon, but as the guest. He even thanks it. The guest has taken the burden of speech from us, he writes. We no longer need to ask forgiveness. It forgives first. That line alone ensured the journal's sequestration. After all, any suggestion that grace could come from outside sanctioned channels was enough to melt even papal patience. You picture it vividly. The abbey lit by dwindling candles, monks kneeling in rows, the walls creaking like lungs. Somewhere in the distance, wolves cry, a sound indistinguishable from mourning. It's beautiful in a horrifying way. There's something strangely tender about a faith stretched so thin it becomes transparent, like ice revealing the water beneath. You can almost admire their perseverance, men freezing slowly, praying themselves into delirium, yet still believing that reciting the same Latin phrase would thaw reality back into order. It didn't. On the 40th night, a storm hit. The roof collapsed over the chapel, burying the altar in snow. Only 12 monks survived. They were rescued days later by villagers who found them huddled in silence around the shattered crucifix, lips blue, eyes open. None of them ever spoke again, not even to confess. The abbey was abandoned after that. Its stones were scavenged over the next century for nearby farms, its name erased from parish rosters. The Vatican filed the case as infestatio conclusa per actum divinum, an infestation concluded by divine act. That's polite Latin for God handled it. The Journal of Brother Anselm was sealed, rediscovered briefly in 1923, and reclassified again after an Italian journalist tried to publish excerpts in a spiritualist magazine. The few surviving pages describe his final act, chiseling the words Dominus est frigus, the Lord is cold, into the chapel wall. No one knows if he meant it literally or as a warning. Either way, the phrase survived, etched into a fragment of masonry now stored in a climate-controlled vault. Fitting, you think, that something about frost would be preserved by more frost. Modern theologians occasionally reference sanctum silens in conferences about psycho-spiritual phenomena. The debate usually divides neatly into camps. One side insists it was a mass psychosis triggered by hypothermia. The other argues it was an early encounter with an acoustic haunting, a natural resonance amplified by stone and snow. But there's a third, quieter opinion, rarely published but whispered among Vatican archivists, that the abbey represented a failed exorcism of the world itself, a place where silence became so absolute it turned inward and spoke back. That idea lingers, uncomfortable and poetic, the kind of thought that keeps you up at night. Because if silence can talk, what does it say about the prayers we've forgotten? You run your hand along a cold wall in the present, half expecting to feel that same rhythm of knocks beneath your palm. Instead, there's only the faint hum of a modern air vent, a mechanical echo of those old ghostly breaths. Outside, Rome is mild tonight, but for a moment, you imagine snow falling softly through the Vatican courtyard, settling on statues and railings like memory returning uninvited. You can almost smell the wax, hear the distant toll of bells from that long-frozen abbey. And if you listen carefully, very carefully, you might catch a faint knocking in the distance. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. You smile despite yourself, whispering into the dark, if it is the devil, then he prays with us. The words leave your lips and vanish into the still air, absorbed by walls that have heard far worse. You walk on, deeper into the Vatican's underbelly, feeling warmth return to your fingertips, even as the story itself turns colder. Somewhere behind you, unseen, the air sighs. Once, twice, as if exhaling a prayer it's been holding for 300 years. And you think, not for the first time, that maybe faith was never about light conquering darkness. Maybe it's about learning to see in the cold. You move forward through time the way a candle melts, slowly, silently, leaving traces of smoke where certainty used to be. The air grows heavier as you descend beneath Rome again, into the network of ancient tunnels that predate the Vatican itself. They call them catacombs, but in truth they're more like veins, arteries of memory winding beneath marble churches and cafes where tourists sip espresso, blissfully unaware that beneath their chairs lie miles of bone and silence. You follow a corridor that smells faintly of damp limestone and old oil, your footsteps soft against the gravel floor. The deeper you go, the more your flashlight flickers, as if reluctant to trespass on history's private hours. You pause before a narrow archway carved with symbols, fish, crosses, and something stranger, a pair of eyes etched upside down. The guidebooks never mention that part. A shiver crawls up your spine, not from fear, but from the realization that this place has heard prayers in every language and yet keeps its own counsel. A mainstream historical fact steadies your mind. By the 3rd century, Rome's Christians had begun burying their dead in these catacombs, digging elaborate chambers into volcanic tufa stone. More than 60 such sites honeycomb the city, layered across centuries, stacked like pages in a forgotten gospel. And here, in the 1930s, archaeologists unearthed something the church quietly reburied, a chamber filled not with saints, but with symbols of exorcism, circles drawn in soot, inscriptions invoking Michael Arcangela, and tiny amphorae sealed with wax, each marked Spiritus Redactus, spirit reduced. The discovery was so unsettling that Vatican officials removed it from official maps within weeks. The lead archaeologist, a man named Dr. Ernesto Cavalli, wrote privately that the chamber sang at night, a description his peers dismissed as poetic embellishment. But his assistant recorded hearing faint, rhythmic murmurs echoing through the tunnels long after their crew had left. The records end abruptly in 1938, the same year Cavalli vanished during a second expedition. His flashlight was later found upright in a pile of dust, its battery drained but the bulb still intact. You tell yourself that's not creepy at all. You press onward, deeper into the tunnels, where frescoes of early martyrs watch you with eyes too wide to be serene. Their painted halos have darkened over the centuries, iron oxide mixing with moisture until the saints look slightly scorched, like they've seen what happened after prayer stopped working. You pause near one depiction, an angel holding a trumpet, wings spread across the wall like a warning. Beneath it, in a script so fine it could be a whisper, someone has carved Loquuntur ossa. The bones speak. You lean closer, tracing the letters with your gloved hand, and the wall feels warm. Impossibly warm for stone buried 10 meters underground. A drop of water falls from the ceiling, landing with a sound too sharp for water. Somewhere in the darkness, a faint echo answers it. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. You almost laugh at the familiarity. The frozen abbey left its rhythm here, it seems. Or maybe all the world's hauntings eventually echo into one another. There's a story told only among archivists, the kind of rumor that moves quietly between candlelit desks and locked cabinets. It says that during the early 18th century, the Vatican authorized an exorcism inside the catacombs themselves. The target was not a person, but the tunnels, after reports that workers refurbishing burial chambers heard voices chanting the Pater Noster backward. The rite lasted 3 nights, led by 2 Jesuits and 1 Benedictine friar, and was said to have ended when the chanting stopped, replaced by the sound of weeping that came from no identifiable source. The church never repeated the experiment. In official terms, the site was simply reconsecrated. But some suspect the ritual awakened something that had only been listening before. A fringe tidbit from an obscure Jesuit letter supports this. The walls remember. They give back what they hear. You try not to imagine what centuries of grief might sound like if it decided to sing. It's easy, wandering here, to mistake echoes for company. Your own breath bounces off the curved stone like a ghost rehearsing your lines. Yet sometimes the reverberations don't match. You whisper hello, and the reply takes too long to return. You tell yourself it's the acoustics, the way sound bends and loops in confined spaces, but that explanation feels too neat. You pause to listen more carefully. There it is again, a low hum, steady, distant, almost musical. It vibrates through the stone, faint but rhythmic, like a choir practicing beneath the earth. The tone shifts as you move, harmonizing with the scrape of your boots. For a moment, you think you recognize words. Latin, yes, but distorted. The vowels stretched until they dissolve into vibration. It feels less like a chant and more like a warning disguised as melody. You reach a larger chamber, circular, with niches carved into the walls for bodies long gone. The bones were removed decades ago, yet the emptiness feels heavier than any grave. In the center stands a marble slab etched with unfamiliar sigils, a triangle within a circle, lines radiating outward like rays of light or sound. A small plaque nearby identifies it as Ara Mutorum, the altar of whispers. The name alone should make you turn around, but you don't, because you, like every poor soul who ever descended here, have mistaken curiosity for courage. The air thickens, metallic, humming faintly against your eardrums. You crouch down to inspect the carvings and notice something strange. The dust around the altar is disturbed, patterned in faint rings, as if something invisible has been moving in circles. You place your hand just above the stone, and the vibration pulses through your palm like a heartbeat. You pull back, heart racing, and laugh under your breath. The nervous kind of laugh that's half apology, half plea for rationality. A mainstream historical footnote intrudes again. Acoustic engineers in the late 20th century actually studied parts of the catacombs to understand their sound dynamics. They discovered that certain chambers produce perfect standing waves at low frequencies, meaning whispers can travel and amplify, creating the illusion of multiple voices. Perfectly explainable science, except that some of those frequencies fall below the threshold of human hearing. Infrasound, they call it, capable of inducing unease, nausea, even hallucination. Logical, yes. Comforting? Not really, especially when you consider that medieval priests already knew about it, though they called it something else. Vox mortua, the dead voice. It's written in a 13th century Benedictine manual, where the earth moans without cause, avoid prayer, for it listens. You try not to think about that as your flashlight sputters again, strobing light across the carvings. For a split second, the patterns seem to shift, as though rearranging themselves to form new symbols. But when the light steadies, they're unchanged. Probably. You back away slowly, turning your light toward the corridor you came from. But the tunnel now feels unfamiliar, the air thicker, warmer. You hear footsteps, soft, deliberate, matching yours with perfect timing. You stop. They stop. You move again. They follow. You tell yourself it's the echo, until one step falls a fraction too late. That's when you start walking faster, muttering a half-hearted joke to no one. If anyone's down here, you whisper, you're about 100 years too late for confession. Your voice dies in the air. Then, from somewhere deeper in the dark, comes the faintest whisper, your name. Not shouted, not moaned, just spoken, softly, as if from behind glass. You freeze, pulse pounding in your ears, waiting for a reason that doesn't come. For the first time, the silence feels personal. There's another verifiable note buried in the Vatican's internal memos, dated 1954, referencing an unauthorized exploration beneath the Basilica of San Sebastiano. 2 of the 3 explorers were employees of the Archivum Secretum. Their recovered notes mention resonant phenomena of unknown source and subjective auditory impressions of psalmody. The memo concludes with a recommendation: no further descent is to be permitted without papal order. But in the margins, someone scrawled a single word: continua. Continue. The handwriting, oddly enough, matches Cavalli's from 1938, either a coincidence or a ghost with a flair for bureaucratic persistence. You'd almost admire the dedication if your heart weren't still trying to punch through your ribs. You find yourself speaking out loud, partly to fill the silence, partly to prove you still exist. You're just echoes, you say, though your voice shakes. You're the past arguing with itself. The words sound brave until you realize they came out in a whisper, as if your own lungs don't trust them. The tunnel ahead narrows, forcing you to crouch. The air tastes like dust and copper, the taste of time itself dissolving on your tongue. Then, just as you're about to stand, you notice faint scratches along the wall, tally marks, hundreds of them, carved by an unsteady hand. Between the rows, a short inscription reads, "They sing until you answer." The marks stop abruptly at chest height, the final line unfinished. You feel a rush of sympathy for whoever stood here before you, counting the days or perhaps the replies. What follows next happens so quietly you almost doubt it. The hum returns, low, steady, familiar. Only now it's not distant, it's beneath your feet. The floor vibrates softly, rhythmically, as if something huge and slow is breathing under the stone. Dust trickles from the ceiling in lazy spirals. The air temperature drops. You should leave, you know that, but your body refuses to move, because somewhere in that vibration, there's a pattern you recognize. It's the same cadence as the monks chanting in the frozen abbey. You close your eyes, and for a heartbeat, you hear their voices clearly. Latin words blending into music, sorrow turning into sound, and beneath them, something else joins in. Not demonic, not divine, just impossibly old. It hums through you, a resonance that feels both alien and intimate, like the earth itself remembering your heartbeat. When you open your eyes again, the tunnel is utterly still. The hum is gone. Only the echo of your own breath remains. You make your way back toward the surface, the path winding upward in weary spirals. The air grows warmer, and the modern world seeps back in. The faint vibration of subway trains, the muffled thrum of Roman traffic, the living pulse of a city that long ago built itself atop the dead. You emerge into night, blinking beneath streetlights that feel far too bright. Somewhere above, church bells toll midnight, the traditional hour of transition when one day becomes the next and perhaps one world brushes against another. You exhale, realizing your hands are trembling, though you can't tell whether from fear or awe. You glance back at the gated entrance, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. There's no one. Just the steady drip of water from the stones, a rhythm that sounds almost like applause. You walk toward the Tiber, where the city lights shimmer on the river's surface like restless souls. You think about the bones beneath your feet, the voices that refuse to fade, the echoes that might be more than echoes. And you understand something simple, yet unsettling. Exorcisms are not always about banishing the past. They're about admitting it still speaks. Maybe that's what the catacombs have been doing all along, repeating the stories no one wanted to hear, humming them into the stone until the living finally listen. You smile faintly, whispering, "I'm listening." The wind stirs. Somewhere deep underground, something answers, not with words, but with a sigh of relief, as though silence itself has been waiting centuries to be heard. The centuries collapse around you like folded parchment, and when you look up, it's no longer candlelight flickering on stone. It's the cold, humming fluorescence of the 20th century. The Vatican corridors are the same, but the silence has changed. Once it was sacred, now it's bureaucratic. You stand in front of a plain wooden door with a modern brass label, Ufficio per l'indagine del paranormale, 1952, the Office for Paranormal Inquiry. Most people don't even know it existed. The sign was replaced decades ago with something far less exciting, Historical Conservation Bureau. But behind the same door, the same dust still sleeps. You turn the handle, and a gust of stale air escapes, smelling faintly of old reel-to-reel tape and candle wax, a strange marriage of analog and divine. The room is lined with steel filing cabinets, their drawers labeled in faded typewriter ink, Exorcismi, Archivi Vecchi, Case Strain, and your favorite, Appunti senza spiegazione, notes without explanation. The church had reached the era of sound recording, but some secrets refused to quiet down. A single, mainstream historical fact anchors this time. In 1949, the Vatican formally approved the continued study of demonic possession using modern recording devices, after American Jesuit William Bowdern's famous St. Louis case, the one that inspired a Hollywood movie later, though the script left out the paperwork. You imagine these Italian priests poring over wax cylinders, listening to static and breathing, hoping for theology to appear in the waveform. The tapes in front of you are labeled Roma, Sant'Anna, 1953. You thread one through a clunky gray player that looks like it belongs in a Cold War spy film. The reel begins to spin, slow and sticky. At first, there's nothing but static. Then a voice, male, low, wavering, recorded too close to the microphone. Non è la mia voce, it says. It isn't my voice. Then silence, then breathing, deep, measured, almost mechanical. You freeze because it doesn't sound possessed. It sounds like someone trying to imitate possession. And you realize that, in this modern age, demons have learned how to perform for tape. Across the 1950s, the Vatican's so-called mirror missions multiplied. Priests and technicians traveled across Europe, armed not with relics, but microphones. They called their devices specie sonori, sound mirrors, believing that evil, if real, would distort magnetic tape. A fringe but documented theory, credited to Father Giuseppe Tanzini, proposed that spirits could alter electromagnetic resonance, leaving measurable anomalies. His 1956 paper in Archivio di Parapsicologia Teologica claims with charming conviction that the devil prefers static. His colleagues laughed him into retirement, but his notebooks survived, filled with sketches of oscillating sine waves shaped into crosses. The Church tolerated such experiments, half out of curiosity, half out of hope that science might finally agree with theology. It didn't. What it did produce were hundreds of hours of eerie recordings, moans, muttered prayers, and sometimes words too crisp to be random noise. One of those tapes, rediscovered in the 1980s, bears a notation in Latin, vox in speculo loquitur. The voice in the mirror speaks. The story attached to it comes from a convent outside Naples, where a young nun named Sister Beatrice reportedly underwent what the local bishop described as an identity bifurcation. According to the transcripts, she spoke in her normal tone by day and another at night, slow, deliberate, curious, as if listening more than speaking. During one recorded session, she looked directly into a wall mirror and asked, "Who prays when I sleep?" The reflection, according to witnesses, moved its lips a second too late. Of course, psychologists today might call this dissociation mirror therapy gone wrong, or the stress of confinement. But even modern language can't erase the cold simplicity of her final line on tape. He forgave me in reverse. You rewind that reel in your mind as you wander through the archive, brushing dust off shelves that haven't been touched since the era of typewriters. Somewhere behind the walls, the Vatican's heating system groans, a low mechanical hum that sounds suspiciously like a sigh. The priests of this era were men caught between centuries. They wore cassocks, but read Scientific American. They prayed over oscilloscope readouts, convinced that if evil existed, it would leave a measurable trace. There's a 1958 photo of Father Tanzini kneeling beside a possessed woman, one hand holding a crucifix, the other resting casually on a tape recorder. It's the perfect metaphor for mid-century faith. Half ritual, half experiment, entirely uncertain. A mainstream detail to ground you again. By the late 1960s, official exorcisms had declined sharply. Vatican II had modernized theology, emphasizing psychology over demons, mercy over fear. The Ritual Romanum was quietly revised. Yet the cases didn't stop. They simply moved underground, literally and figuratively. In one 1971 file labeled Progetto Echo, the Church authorized a collaboration with a group of Italian physicists from the University of Milan. Their goal was to build an electrosacral field detector, a device meant to record fluctuations in human brainwaves during prayer or possession. They never succeeded, but they did notice something odd. During several tests inside old chapels, the magnetic field spiked whenever Gregorian chants reached a certain pitch. Later analysis suggested simple acoustics, resonance between stone and voice. But Father Tanzini, still alive, still stubborn, scribbled in the margin, "Faith vibrates." One fringe tidbit from this period deserves mention. mostly because it reads like the plot of a forgotten Italian horror film. In 1976, an exorcism in Turin was allegedly broadcast via shortwave radio by accident, bleeding into nearby frequencies. Listeners across northern Italy reported hearing fragments of Latin prayers over popular music, mixed with screams and laughter. The Vatican denied everything, yet radio technicians confirmed the interference originated near a Jesuit seminary. The next morning, the seminary's power transformers exploded. Official cause: lightning. Unofficial cause: too much truth on one frequency. You'd roll your eyes, except the story appears in both diocesan maintenance logs and the Corriere della Sera police report. Coincidence, sure, but a stylish one. By the 1980s, technology had replaced candles as the church's flashlight into darkness. Cassette recorders, early video cameras, even thermal sensors found their way into exorcism kits. Some priests swore by them, others swore at them. One Jesuit famously called his camcorder "my second guardian angel." His tapes remain sealed, though rumors claim they capture a possession where the afflicted woman's voice splits into two tones at once, one high, one impossibly low, vibrating the glass in the window panes. Acoustic engineers analyzed the footage and concluded the effect was humanly improbable. The priest, asked for comment, reportedly smiled and said, "Miracles and errors share the same frequency." It's hard not to like him. Of course, science didn't kill exorcism, it just gave it better microphones. Throughout the 1990s, the Vatican re-established formal training for exorcists, acknowledging that evil may be psychological but remains profitable for faith. The files label it pastoral necessity, which is ecclesiastical Latin for "don't let Hollywood have all the fun." And so modern priests learn to use tape decks alongside relics, digital meters alongside prayers. Some of those devices are still here, stacked in boxes labeled inutilizzato, unused. You pick one up, a small silver recorder, lightweight, battery corroded. You click it on out of instinct. It whirs once, sputters, then dies. But for a split second before it cuts out, you hear it. 1 second of sound, faint, almost human. Ascolta, listen. You set it down carefully, laughing softly. Yeah, I'm listening. The room seems to creak in reply. For all the centuries of ritual, research, and rewrites, the Church's greatest struggle remains the same. Not casting out evil, but defining it. In the modern world, possession often wears a lab coat or a uniform, speaks through propaganda or addiction instead of ancient tongues. Demons have updated their software. The priests have too, barely. You leaf through a 1999 report titled Interferenze Spirituali nei Sistemi Digitali, Spiritual Interference in Digital Systems. It claims that during an online broadcast of a mass, the live stream glitched, looping the phrase, "Libera nos a malo," deliver us from evil, for 3 full minutes before correcting itself. The Vatican 1T department blamed bandwidth. The theologians called it an echo of intention. Either way, it made an excellent sermon. As you flip through these pages, you can't help but think about mirrors. The literal kind, the digital kind, the ones made of glass or pixels. The Church used to fear reflective surfaces during exorcisms, believing they could trap souls mid-expulsion. Now, priests broadcast blessings over screens that reflect millions of faces at once. The boundary between sacred and simulated has never been thinner. Maybe that's why they still keep these recordings locked away. Not because they prove evil, but because they prove ambiguity. And ambiguity has always been the Vatican's least favorite miracle. You sit down at a dusty desk, turning off your flashlight so the only glow comes from the green emergency light above the exit. The cabinets loom like silent confessors. You imagine Father Tanzini sitting in this same spot decades ago, listening to the hiss of his tapes, wondering if static might be the purest prayer of all. After all, both are made of longing disguised as noise. The air feels thick, humming faintly with the electricity of forgotten ideas. You rest your palms on the desk and feel a faint vibration, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat beneath metal. It could be the building. It could be something older, still trying to be heard through the layers of technology that were supposed to silence it. The modern church has learned to smile for cameras, to perform faith with the precision of public relations. But in these hidden archives, far from pilgrims and reporters, faith still trembles, raw and unpolished. You think of the old catacomb inscription, Loquentur ossa. The bones speak. Now the machines do too. And the message, it seems, hasn't changed. Remember us. You close the drawer, dust rising like incense. Outside, Rome hums with nightlife, neon and laughter echoing down cobbled streets. Yet beneath it all the same undertone persists. A low, steady vibration, the sound of belief refusing to die, adapting instead. You step back into the corridor, flicking off the archive lights one by one. Each click feels like closing a confession booth on the past. At the door, you glance over your shoulder and catch your reflection in a glass cabinet. For a second, the image lags, just a heartbeat behind you, then catches up. You grin, half amused, half resigned. Took you long enough, you mutter. The glass doesn't answer, but a soft hum fills the silence, almost like laughter. You take that as a good sign. After all, in a world full of digital demons and recorded prayers, maybe humor is the last true exorcism left. You push open the door, step into the warm night air, and leave the Vatican's humming heart behind, though somewhere deep inside its walls, a lone tape still spins, whispering a scolta to anyone foolish enough to press play. The city never really sleeps, but tonight Rome feels quieter than usual. Streets washed silver by drizzle, every cobblestone reflecting the halo of a passing street lamp. You walk alone, collar turned up, the modern world receding with every echo of your footsteps. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls midnight, soft and deliberate, like a hand knocking politely on heaven's door. It's the hour when stories resurface, the ones the Vatican swears don't exist anymore. Among archivists and theologians alike, none is whispered with more discomfort than the Rituale Cypriani, the so-called banned rite of Saint Cyprian. To the faithful, Cyprian is the patron of magicians turned repentant. To the fearful, he is the saint who learned too much. The Church canonized him for martyrdom in 304 AD, then spent 17 centuries trying to erase the book attributed to him, a text rumored to blur the line between exorcism and invocation. You turn a corner, pass a shuttered cafe, and imagine the legend flickering like a candle at the edge of reason. The mainstream historical record keeps it tidy. A collection of prayers falsely credited to Cyprian appeared in Iberia during the late 17th century and was condemned by the Inquisition in 1631 under the title Clavicula Cypriani, the Key of Cyprian. But that's only the clean version. The dirtier one, preserved in a handful of Portuguese monasteries, insists that certain pages came from an earlier manuscript discovered in the catacombs beneath Antioch, inked with blood and salt water, its letters said to shimmer when read aloud by candlelight. The text, according to those who claim to have seen it, offered not a way to cast out demons, but to negotiate with them, a diplomatic manual for the damned. You chuckle softly at the absurdity, but your smile fades as you recall that the Vatican's Index of Prohibited Books lists Clavicula Cypriani not once, but 3 times, each entry crossed out in different handwriting, erasing an erasure, classic Rome. The story resurfaces in 1965, when a Portuguese priest named Father Miguel da Fonseca attempted to translate a surviving copy. His correspondence, part theology, part confession, describes a manuscript bound in rough goatskin, pages brittle as pastry, the ink glinting like graphite. Inside were ritual diagrams mixing Christian symbols with pagan geometry, crosses nested inside 7-pointed stars, Latin psalms intersecting with Greek invocations of forgotten deities. On one page, in neat cursive, a recipe for holy oil that included ashes of saintly hair. On another, a prayer that began normally, in nomine Patris, then veered into untranslatable syllables that no linguist has ever mapped to a known tongue. Scholars debate whether it was glossolalia, code, or delirium, but Father Miguel called it a tongue spoken sideways. He worked on the translation for 3 months before writing a final, terrified letter to his bishop. The words answer when I stop reading. The letter was dated September 14th. The following day, neighbors reported seeing light flicker in the priest's window, though his house had lost electricity during a storm. When they forced the door, they found his desk overturned, pages scattered, every candle melted flat. The manuscript was gone. Only one scrap remained, a single line that read, "To command, one must first confess." The phrase has since become the slogan of every occultist with a typewriter, but in the Vatican archives it's catalogued under pericolo verbale, verbal hazard. You find yourself now in a small library annex beneath the Basilica of St. Mary Major, following the trail of this cursed text. The humidity makes the air taste faintly of iron, and the fluorescent bulbs hum with the indifference of modernity. A young archivist with kind eyes hands you a sealed envelope marked simply CYP-CONF. Inside, a photo of a yellowed page. The handwriting is Portuguese, the ink rust-colored. The header reads, "Ritual para o silencio dos possuídos." Ritual for the silence of the possessed. The instructions are almost mundane. Draw a circle, light 7 wicks, recite Psalm 91 backwards. But at the bottom, in a faint margin note, something stranger. If the Spirit obeys, mirror it. If it mocks, name it with your reflection. You stare at those words, uneasy. The Church's dislike of mirrors suddenly feels justified. There's a small, mainstream but eerie footnote to all this. In 1973, the same year The Exorcist premiered, the Vatican quietly reissued an internal memorandum forbidding clergy from consulting unverified Iberian ritual texts. Publicly, they were responding to Hollywood sensationalism. Privately, rumor says the prohibition followed an incident in Lisbon, where a retired exorcist suffered cardiac arrest during a televised interview. Viewers swore the studio lights flickered in rhythm with his last words. Cyprian was never canonized for this. No one ever found the missing audio tape. For the skeptics, of course, the so-called banned rite is nothing more than a collage of folk prayers and apocrypha, medieval fan fiction bound by fear. Yet something about it refuses to die. Every few decades, copies surface in unexpected places. A monastery attic in Coimbra, a flea market in Seville, a private library in São Paulo. Each looks slightly different, yet each contains the same 3 constants: the confession of command, the 7 names of mercy, and a recipe for holy iron dust, the same ingredient found earlier in that nameless book you discovered in Section 2. You almost laugh at the coincidence until you remember that coincidence has been the Church's favorite disguise for centuries. Fringe researchers delight in connecting the dots. One Jesuit anthropologist claimed that the rite was never meant to expel demons, but to identify impostors, humans masquerading as holy. He cited a passage that commands the reader to turn the prayer inward until the heart responds. The idea being that true faith would resonate like a tuning fork, while deceit would stay silent. If that's real, the Rituale Cipriani wasn't heresy at all. It was quality control. Naturally, that interpretation didn't please anyone with a hierarchy to maintain. Still, traces of the rite linger in popular superstition. In rural Portugal, villagers once buried small iron crosses inscribed with Cyprian's name beneath doorways to ward off envy. In parts of Brazil, where Catholicism entwined with Afro-Brazilian spiritualism, O Livro de São Cipriano became a household talisman, a manual not for priests, but for fishermen, midwives, and farmers. They read it by kerosene light, mumbling verses to calm storms or silence nightmares. The Vatican called it sorcery. The people called it survival. You can almost admire the adaptability of faith. It always finds a local accent. The most controversial modern sighting of the book happened in 1994 at a Benedictine retreat near Évora. A young monk, Brother Tomas, claimed to have found a locked wooden box inside an unused confessional. Inside were parchments bearing a red wax seal imprinted with a sigil resembling intertwined keys. Against orders, he opened one. Within a week, he began complaining of auditory hallucinations, voices whispering in Latin fragments of the Psalms, but inverted, as though sung by a mirror. The abbey physician diagnosed exhaustion. The abbess, more practical, sealed the box again and had it buried in the cloister garden. A year later, a storm uprooted the olive tree planted above it. The roots had grown in perfect spirals around the box, splitting it cleanly in two. Half the parchments were soaked beyond recovery. The other half bore faint scorch marks, as if they'd been close to fire that never touched them. The Vatican retrieved the remains and filed them under Documenta Cipriani. Status: contaminato. You pace the library, the story looping in your mind like the reels from the modern recordings. Each century adds its layer of static, yet the same melody persists: control, confession, reflection. Maybe the Ritual Cipriani wasn't about summoning or banishing at all, but about forcing the practitioner to face the thin membrane between faith and arrogance. One line in the surviving fragment supports this. He who names the darkness learns the shape of his own shadow. You whisper it under your breath, and your voice seems to echo, even though the room is too small for echoes. You tell yourself it's acoustics again, but the air feels denser, as if the sentence had physical weight. An officially acknowledged historical fact: Pope John XXIII did commission a secret review of forbidden texts during the 1960s, hoping to modernize the Church's understanding of superstition. According to declassified notes, one consultant described the Rituale Cipriani as a theological paradox, sin written in the grammar of grace. He urged that it be studied, not suppressed. His recommendation was ignored, and his report reclassified as interno delirium. Yet in the margin, someone, perhaps a secretary, had added a cryptic pencil mark, a small triangle within a circle, the same symbol carved on the altar you saw deep in the catacombs. You stare at that image in your memory, realizing that these stories are not isolated, they're cross-referenced by time itself. Night deepens outside the basilica. The drizzle has become rain, tapping softly against the old windows. The fluorescent light above you buzzes, falters, then steadies. You close the folder, exhale, and notice that the dust on the desk has formed faint concentric rings, as if stirred by vibration. You wait, half amused, half unnerved, but nothing else happens. Maybe it's the rumble of distant traffic. Maybe it's an echo from the pipes. Maybe it's the kind of coincidence Cyprian would have called proof. There's one last piece to this puzzle, a detail buried in an otherwise dull financial ledger from 1967. It records an expense labeled Restauro Cipriani Codex, Vatican Press, Room 13. Officially, no such room exists. The ledger's next line allocates funds for binding of prohibited liturgical material, for internal reference only. Someone paid to restore the band right. Someone decided it still had use. And that's when you remember Father Miguel's last note. The words answer when I stop reading. What if the Church didn't want to destroy the book, but to keep it on call? A theological hotline for emergencies too strange for official ritual. You almost laugh again. Of course, the Vatican would keep a backup demon manual. Bureaucracy never wastes paperwork. Still, curiosity has its own gravity. You return the file to its drawer, glance at your reflection in the dark window, and for a heartbeat it looks older, wearier, perhaps amused. You blink, it's gone. Somewhere beyond the rain, a bell rings. One chime only. The archives settle into silence, and in that hush, you understand why this ritual remains banned. Not because it invites evil, but because it invites equality. It suggests that anyone can confront the darkness directly, without clerical supervision. That kind of empowerment has always been more frightening to institutions than any demon. You leave the annex quietly, footsteps muffled on marble. The hall lights flicker as you pass, and for an instant your shadow multiplies. 2, then 3 versions of yourself marching alongside, perfectly synchronized until they fade. You smile, whispering the old Latin benediction taught to exorcists before sleep. Si obscurum venit, ride. If the darkness comes, laugh. The echo that follows sounds suspiciously like agreement. Outside, the rain has stopped, and the city gleams as if newly washed of sin. You walk into the open air, certain of only one thing. The forbidden rites never really disappear. They just change custodians. Tonight, that custodian happens to be you. The rain has passed, and Rome glows under a half moon that hangs like a suspended blessing. The streets shine, reflecting golden pools of lamplight and the muted murmurs of late-night cafes. You walk slowly, feeling the weight of the stories you've gathered. The exorcisms, the frozen abbey, the voices that hummed through the catacombs, the recordings that refused to stay silent. Every tale feels less like discovery and more like an initiation. The Vatican domes loom ahead, silvered in mist, as if the city itself is exhaling. Somewhere behind those guarded walls, you know the files of the Rituale Cipriani are still sealed in their cabinets, humming quietly, waiting. Yet for the first time, the thought doesn't feel frightening. It feels inevitable. Perhaps belief has always been a two-way mirror, and the longer you stare into it, the more it learns to stare back. Inside the basilica, the air is cold, not with temperature, but with reverence. You move past tourist stanchions and into the nave, your footsteps whispering over marble in a rhythm that reminds you of heartbeat and prayer. The candles burn low, pools of gold trembling in the breath of unseen drafts. Somewhere in the side chapel, a priest hums softly, a melody without words, perhaps a lullaby disguised as devotion. The incense lingers, sweet and bitter, wrapping around you like memory itself. This is where the line between ritual and repetition vanishes. You realize that faith, after centuries of exorcisms, relics, and forbidden manuscripts, still revolves around the same fragile hope that words can keep the dark at bay. Yet the dark has never been an intruder. It's always been the other side of light's confession. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. The Vatican officially revised the Ritual Romanum again in 1999, simplifying the prayers, modernizing the language, stripping away the dramatics of medieval fear. The new text replaced the word possessio with disturbatio. Not possession, but disturbance. You can't help but smile at the precision. It's almost poetic. Even the Church now admits that sometimes it's not the devil inside us, but just the noise of being human. Still, not everyone approved. Some older exorcists refuse to adopt the new wording, insisting that evil prefers euphemisms. One of them, Father Lucchesi, whose case reports you glimpsed earlier in the archives, wrote in his private notes, "They've forgotten that the devil is also a linguist." It's hard not to respect a man who writes theological stand-up. You find yourself walking toward the confessionals, those dark wooden booths that resemble tiny theaters for guilt. You've seen enough of the Church's archives to know that half its mysteries were born in places like this, whispered sins mutating into doctrines. You sit inside one, purely out of curiosity. The cushion sighs beneath your weight. The air smells faintly of dust and centuries-old polish. You close your eyes. For a moment, nothing happens. Then a whisper, not a voice, but an awareness, seems to lean close. It's not speaking Latin or Portuguese or any of the tongues you've read about. It's the universal hum of understanding. You realize you're not being offered forgiveness. You're being asked a question. Do you still believe in silence? You open your mouth to answer, but your own words feel redundant. Maybe silence is belief's truest form, the one language that never needs translation. The hum fades, replaced by the creak of the wooden partition. A shadow shifts behind the lattice. You glimpse movement, a figure, perhaps a priest, perhaps a memory. The voice that follows is low and calm. You've been listening too long. You almost laugh. It sounds exactly like something a Vatican librarian would say to a sleepless researcher. "And?" you whisper. The reply comes slower this time, deliberate. Now something listens to you. The partition goes still. The air thickens, heavy with incense and static. You wait for fear to arrive, but instead you feel only clarity, a strange, electric peace. Maybe this is what exorcists misunderstood all along. The sacred isn't louder than evil, it's quieter. The miracle isn't that prayers banish darkness, but that darkness sometimes answers back politely. You leave the confessional and drift toward the altar. A faint wind rustles through the basilica, flickering the candles. The light dances across mosaics that tell the entire human story in fragments. Creation, betrayal, redemption, repetition. You tilt your head upward to the dome, tracing the gilded ribs that disappear into shadow. Somewhere up there, angels hover in frescoes, their wings caught mid-motion. But you think about all the others, the ones without wings, without names, whose whispers kept this building alive for 2,000 years. If holiness has a frequency, it must sound like this, soft, persistent, endless. A fringe tidbit, found in an unpublished Vatican seminar transcript from 2003, crosses your mind. It described a debate between two theologians about the purpose of exorcism in modern times. One argued it should be abolished, calling it a relic of medieval psychology. The other disagreed. Exorcism is not about devils. It's about the church confronting its reflection. The moderator ended the session early. The transcript's final note reads simply, "Both were correct." You smile, realizing that everything you've read, the forbidden trials, the colonial confessions, the magnetic tapes, was never about chasing demons out of the world. It was about cataloging the human instinct to give shape to fear. The Vatican has always been a museum of echoes, and you, foolishly or bravely, have spent the night as its curator. You move toward the exit, footsteps softer now, as though the marble itself has learned your rhythm. The air outside is cooler, tinged with the faint metallic scent of rain. You pause at the threshold, glancing back once more at the vast nave behind you. The candles have burned down to nubs, tiny stars in an ocean of shadow. For the first time, the silence doesn't feel empty. It feels full, crowded with memory, heavy with the presence of everything unseen yet deeply felt. Maybe that's what faith has always been. Not light against dark, but the understanding that both speak the same language if you're patient enough to listen. As you step into the open air, the bells toll again. Their sound rolls over the rooftops, blending with the hum of the city. Cars, laughter, the low thrum of late trains. Rome breathes, eternal and exhausted, and you breathe with it. Somewhere above, the moon slips behind a thin cloud, and for a heartbeat, the world feels perfectly balanced between shadow and illumination. You remember the words carved on that ancient wall in Bavaria. Dominus est frigus. The Lord is cold. Maybe he is. Or maybe, like ice, belief only looks still when it's moving too slowly for the eye to see. The road leads you toward the Tiber, its dark surface glinting under the faint light. You pause on a bridge, watching ripples move like restless souls. Across the water, the Vatican silhouette rises, a city within a city, both fortress and confessional. You think of the monks frozen in prayer, of the jungle friars who mistook healing for heresy, of Sister Beatrice talking to her reflection, of Father Tanzini recording static that sounded suspiciously like grace. You think of St. Cyprian's vanished manuscript, the one that claimed command begins with confession. Maybe that's what you've been doing all along, confessing, quietly, to the idea that belief still matters, even when no one's sure what it means. You close your eyes and listen. The city hums, the river sighs, and somewhere distant, thunder mutters like an old god clearing his throat. And then, faintly, you hear it. The same rhythm that followed you from the abbey to the catacombs, from the archives to this bridge. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. Only this time it doesn't come from beneath or behind. It comes from inside you, steady and calm, as if the heartbeat itself has joined the liturgy. You realize that maybe exorcisms were never about casting something out, but about letting something in, the acceptance that light and shadow share the same pulse. The breeze carries the scent of wet stone and candle smoke, mingling with the quiet electric buzz of street lamps. The world feels suspended, sacred not because it's perfect, but because it's still awake. You whisper to no one in particular, "I'm listening," and the night replies with a single drop of rain landing on your hand, cold, certain, real. You laugh softly, because after all the rituals, the archives, the whispers, the truth was embarrassingly simple. Belief only works if it listens both ways. The Vatican towers fade behind you, just outlines now as you walk toward the edge of dawn. The first hint of morning stretches across the horizon, pale and hesitant, as if testing whether the world still deserves light. Your steps slow. The city exhales. Somewhere in the distance, a choir begins morning mass, soft, rising, imperfect, utterly human. The notes float through the damp air, colliding with the echo of bells and the rhythm of your pulse. You smile, closing your eyes, and for a fleeting moment it all blends. The prayers, the static, the heartbeat, the hum of everything that has ever tried to name the divine. It doesn't sound like victory, it sounds like peace, and for the first time, the silence doesn't whisper. It rests. The bells toll once more, quieter now, as the sun climbs the horizon and washes the marble facades in gold. The world looks newly baptized. You breathe out, slow and steady, watching the mist leave your lips like the final trace of a century-old secret. And just before the light overtakes the last shadow of night, you hear one final fading voice, yours, or maybe the church's, or maybe something older, saying, "It's all forgiven." The air stills. The hum fades. Rome wakes. End of script. Sweet dreams.